Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Full Quadrant podcast. I'm Jason and I got my co-host Michael here joining me for another episode. This is 17, I believe.
Yep. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining. Hopefully, we have a good episode for you guys this time. And we hope you enjoy the previous ones that we've had. But let us know, like always, we ask, let us know what you guys think. But what are we going to talk about this time, Jason?
Yeah, so I think today we had discussed talking about some of the terminology, the vocabulary, the slang or the casual terms that people may hear intermixed in conversation in NePoPo circles, whether you've attended a seminar, you jump onto someone's even our podcasts, right? We throw out some of these terms that are essentially coined, they're probably decades old terms that Bart's used and as NePoPo's been formed and Bart and Michael have been teaching the schools, you hear a lot of these terms that are thrown around. So for people that are not super involved in NePoPo just yet, or maybe this is their first experience with it, a lot of these can kind of go whoom and just fly right over the head. And so we thought it'd be a little bit of entertaining, have some entertainment value to be able to talk about some of these interesting terms that are used.
Because we've heard them a lot and we kind of use them as we're going and we're talking about things. So a lot of times, like you said, people don't understand the context behind it or the meaning behind it.
Right. And really what it is, they're just funny yet interesting classifications for things, just natural things that are observed in dog behavior or dog training. It could be anything. It could be something that the trainer's doing that's described in a unique way that's kind of just stuck over time and that we use it, or it's something that the dog does that, has been given a label or a description. We've got a good list, I think. We've run through a number of these terms, and hopefully this is a nice little glossary for you to navigate the world of NePoPo. So why don't you kick it off? Let's maybe we can just read a couple down the list and talk about them and discuss how they apply, what they mean, and the good, the bad, and everything in between about those.
Well, the one thing that's I remember, and it's a little funny to me, and is when we talk about a bimbo, right? And the way it's mentioned is that we are the bimbo to our dog, right? And it that comes like especially during the free shaping, when you're doing free shaping, where the dog, you are doing whatever the dog wants, right? The dog is controlling you. So, and it's funny because Bart, when he talks about it, he goes, "Hey," and he's talking like the dog, and he'll say, "Hey, Bimbo, give me the food, Bimbo." Right. So the dog is looking at us as just somebody that will do whatever they want. Right.
Right. It's meant to reflect a concept of training that is something you want to act out or play the role of the bimbo, where in the beginning the dog feels powered, they feel empowered, and that's how they begin to build confidence and feel like their actions truly control their environment. It's actually something that you have to implement during the process of building an active dog and building ignition. That's where you're going to see that term used most likely is the the phase of creating more activity in the dog, right? Because that's the consequence or the outcome where the dog feels like, hey, everything I do, if I do this, my owner is like completely bending to my will.
Yeah, and that's where we're, like you said, we're building up the dog so that he thinks he controls everything.
Right.
You know, and I think as we talked before, there's a another side to that. You have to be careful with strong dogs.
You don't want to be the bimbo for the wrong dog.
Yeah, which is, I think that goes into the other one where you talk about Alibaba syndrome,
Yeah.
right? And Alibaba syndrome is, if you know the story of Alibaba and the lamp, where he rubs a lamp and the genie comes out. Well, if you have a strong dog and you do a lot of free shaping and it makes him stronger, then that's where the Alibaba syndrome comes in, where you can't, once you get the genie out of the bottle, you
Can't put
can't
him
put it
back
back
in.
in, right? So that's you have to be careful with a strong dog. You have to make him strong enough to where you still are in control.
So speaking of dogs that could be referencing, what type of dog falls under that category where you would want to be a little bit careful about how you approach building the active dog and giving that dog more confidence?
I would say more like a dominant dog that's already dominant, and is kind of pushy already,
Yeah.
right? If you build
Mm.
that more of the confidence, and then he tips over the edge where he's like, oh, I don't have to do whatever you say, right? I don't have to listen to you.
Right. And it becomes even more risky when the dog is dominant already or becomes dominant, but they have a low threshold for they have a low tolerance of what they will accept. Maybe it's a nerve related thing. Maybe they've got a weaker nerve that triggers and they flip that switch into the dominant behavior. But it's where the dog responds dominantly. That's where you want to be careful, right? The dog could, you have some dogs that are dominant that they're kind of thick and they're kind of like just dense and they don't trigger as easily into their dominant behaviors, but they're like dominant in the sense that they're like very confident in themselves. But it takes a lot before you trigger that dog. It's the dogs that have the low threshold. That's where you have to worry about it because that's when they go quickly to using dominance over you.
Yeah. And then it's you see it like where dogs, they if they don't want to do something, they are gonna stand up to you a little bit, right? They're gonna
Yep.
push back against whatever you're trying to get them to do.
Right. Like a rank dog, right? Dogs that have struggle with the hierarchy.
And that's where one of the things with NePoPo, where we like we say the desire comes out of the dog,
Hmm.
right? But it's also, it's not just the desire comes out of the dog, but the dog has to think that its behavior is what causes things, instead
Yeah.
of thinking that you cause those things necessarily,
Right.
especially with those dogs that are um you know are strong in that sense.
Right. And I mean, this situation, knowing how to build a stronger dog is valuable, but it kind of one of the next, terms that are thrown around in the NePoPo community and is it's the knife that cuts both ways, right?
Yeah, because that's the thing, you can't just add one thing or like make a dog confident without knowing that there's another side to that. If like we talked about, if the dog is already confident or already kind of a pushy dog,
Right.
because you'll get to the point where now you get some scars from
Yeah.
that dog.
Yeah. So
But
you always have to
everything
be
has,
mindful. Go ahead.
yeah, and that's the thing, everything that you do, that term applies to everything that you do, a knife that cuts both ways, right? um, because you have to think about what the consequences are of whatever you're teaching or whatever you're doing in the moment, because it can have other consequences also if you're not careful, right?
Right.
You can go over to the other side, because so
Yeah,
that's, yeah,
it's
we
all
hear
about
that a lot.
balance in dog training,
Correct.
right?
It's all about balance, and not just balance, but knowing what are the advantages and disadvantages of whatever method you're using in the moment.
Right. And
You know,
that's the thing with dog training that I've grown to learn over time is that if it works for the dog, the system or the method that was used was the right system. If the dog looks good doing it and it worked, it was a good system. But even more importantly is knowing why it worked, right? If you don't know
Yeah.
why it works, you're going to say, hey, that worked really well on this dog. I'm going to keep using it until you find the dog that it doesn't work well on. And now you're in a pickle, right? So the important thing about dog training is to being able to understand not just what works, but why it works so that you don't go past a your dog's putting his paw through the kennel. That's hilarious. Um, uh, so you don't go past the point where you are trying to get to. You don't want to go past, overshoot your destination and end up somewhere you didn't want to end up at, right?
Yeah. And that's where, um, like, say, using only rewards, and knowing what reward brings and what pressure brings,
Right.
and where the combination of the two, will create balance in the dog.
Yeah.
Because if it's too many rewards, you're gonna have motivation, but you're gonna have a dog that doesn't concentrate. There's lack of concentration there,
Right.
right? Whereas if you only use pressure, you'll have a dog that's concentrating, but it's possible that the motivation isn't there,
Right.
especially if the pressure is used, um, not used in the, the best it can for that dog.
Right.
But when then you combine the two, now you can have the best of both worlds, the best of motivation and the best of concentration.
And that makes me think of another term that we actually didn't discuss on our list, but the one I've heard frequently, from Bart is using having the champagne finger, right? The champagne finger touch, right? Where what that means is like when you're using your leash or the tools, you use it very lightly. The champagne finger is your pinky finger, and you use it lightly with finesse. You want to use it very, um, just enough to get the job done. It's like another way of saying it, is, the proper dosage of whether it's punishment or correction or reinforcement. You want the proper dosage for the outcome you're looking for.
Yeah. And that's where, there's another, like, that goes into the other thing that he says, where, it's when you're cooking, right? If you use just enough salt, the food's going to taste good, but if you put too much, now you can't even eat that food,
You ruin
right?
it. You ruin it.
Yeah, you ruin it. And it's the same with using rewards and using pressure. Yeah, it's exactly the same. Um,
You know, I want to throw this in there, and this is like not shilling anything here, but that's what's unique about NePoPo. People are still categorizing group NePoPo and like in broad strokes, where they assume looking from the outside in that it's just one, it's a comprehensive system. Like you are allowed to do only positive reinforcement training on certain dogs within NePoPo, and you can still use NePoPo using positive only training. There's still ways to do that. It's like it's not that you if you're not using the e-collar, if you're not using a prong collar or any type of negative reinforcement tool, that you can't be operating within the system of NePoPo. That's the thing that I think a lot of people don't understand is that they just group it into a tool-based system. And we've already had an episode about this because where we talked about NePoPo is it goes beyond the e-collar, right? And we spend a lot of time talking about it there. So if you want to learn more about that and you haven't listened to number 6, I think go back and check out episode 6.
yeah. But that's where the the exactly what you said. Like, NAPOPO is knowing positive reinforcement, the advantages and disadvantages, right? Knowing the reward from positive reinforcement and the punishment side of it, right? Or correction side.
Yeah.
Knowing pressure, negative reinforcement, and knowing the advantages and disadvantages, knowing the combination of the two, and knowing the combination in rewarding and the combination in correcting, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's the thing. It's knowing everything and then using just the right things for
Just
that
the
dog.
right thing. Knowing everything
Right.
and using just the one thing that's going to be the best for that situation.
Which goes into another saying, which is be the architect of your own system. And the way I think of that is not just have a hodgepodge of things you use with a dog, but it's use all the NePoPo building blocks to create your own system. And it's about creating your own system for that particular dog that's in front of you, not
Right.
having a cookie cutter, not creating a cookie cutter system that you do the same thing on every dog. And that's where that be the architect of your own system comes in. It's not one system to fit every dog, but it's creating a separate system for each individual dog.
Yeah. And I think some people feel a little bit too confident in the charge given from Bart and Michael to be the architect of your own system because they go out and be the architect of your own system. But if that system that you are now architecting does not yield a dog with heart and soul and reliability or obedience on cue every time, that system
It's
deviated
missing.
outside.
It's
It went
missing
it went
something.
outside of NePoPo. It missed the point,
Yeah.
right? So yes, there's a lot of ability to go out there and experiment and maybe a dog only needs positive reinforcement, negative punishment to learn everything you want it to do, and it'll look good and it'll do it well every time with heart and soul. That's great. But if it doesn't, then your system has traversed outside of NePoPo, and it's really not NePoPo at that point. Because again, the outcome is what's going to tell you whether the method was good or not. Real quick, I had this thought occur to me. Can we talk about it for the dog training industry, like a post-apocalyptic scenario where all tools are banned? We're taken back to the Stone Age in terms of dog training, right?
Yeah.
How does training look like? Let's assume that, all tools are banned, you know, and which not likely, but like let's just assume that. Like, what does training look like? Or maybe even just venture back, when dogs were first being domesticated, when Canis familiaris started becoming domestically involved with humans, and they started spending time and finding that there was a mutually beneficial relationship, hanging around each other. What was training like back then, and what would training look like if we lost the tools that we have now?
You're talking about going back to the beginning, like when Canis familiaris, you said,
Yeah, like
started
that.
hanging around with
It's
people.
either back when we started first seeing domesticated dogs spending time with humans and learning to do jobs and work alongside humans, or in the future where tools are banned, because it's basically the same scenario, right? You know, talk to me about what did training look like then? Like, how did they train dogs?
Well, I think it was at in the beginning, probably it was all about control, any way they could get it, right? Meaning what we've seen, like in a previous episode, you talked about the cave paintings that have, or the artwork or cave paintings that go back and they show like a rope on a what looks like a dog,
Yeah,
right? So I think they immediately started using tools back then to be able to control the animals, and that had to be the first thing, was control, right?
right.
And then training has evolved in learning how the dogs, what we do. I think the control came first. It wasn't just that the dogs are just walking around and following them around. Um, at it was at the beginning, but then at some point they took control of the dogs, right?
Do you
They
think, I mean, I say this because there one of the terms or phrases, catchphrases used is, they talk about using the sugar and the stick, right?
Yeah.
So maybe kind of explain what that means so people can.
It's that you can't, well, it goes back to balance, right? In training, and it's sugar and stick, because you have to use the motivation for the dog to want to do something, right? Which is the sugar. And that's where the term desire must come out of the dog. But then at the same time, a dog's going to want to do other things in certain instances. And you have to be able to say, you must, right? Which is another term what we say, you must key, which we talked about before.
Right.
So the stick comes in that part saying, okay, I'm going to motivate you with the sugar, but also I'm going to show you must do it with the stick. And it's just a way of saying it's balanced on both sides of the training equation.
Right.
But that's where again, it goes back to the definition of NePoPo, which is the dog training system, where a dog will always do on cue with heart and soul. The only way to get that is to have both
Yeah.
the sugar and the stick.
And what happens when you don't have the stick? What framework does that place your training methodology in?
It's I think you're training with one hand tied behind your back, right? I think it's where we talked about before, where now you have to use like negative punishment. That's your
Well, if you
only
if you yeah, if you haven't
recourse.
ever right. Yeah, and if you haven't ever used the stick, right? If there's no stick in the dog's training, you're setting them up for you're putting them in a framework of training that is going potentially disastrous down the road.
Well, that's another saying, right? It's nay popo, not popo nay, right? And that's the thing. If you don't use the you must or the stick, then and in training as a balance, what happens later is if you try to use it later, then the dog doesn't know what it means, right? There's no understanding from the dog. And then you're hoping the dog figures it out and does the correct thing that you're trying to influence. Or if you're good enough to control the environment so that there's only one thing for the dog to figure out. Right. So if the dog is trying to figure it out in the moment, then I think there's higher stress than if it's taught from the beginning.
The valuable thing about that is that it gives you options, right? Not that like maybe you don't want to use a lot of positive punishment down the road, but it's always preparing your dog for the day you might need to use it. Whether you choose to use that as a consequence or not, at least you've prepared the dog when you do choose to use it so it doesn't blow up in your face.
But what I was saying was like if you're using the stick and it's not balanced and the dog it's all about understanding from the dog. What it leads into another saying that Bart says a lot is the dog will go in the shitter,
What
which
does that mean? What does that look like when
which
the dog
means
does
like
that?
the dog looks like there's too much pressure put on him, right? That it's
And how
and
easy is it to come out of that? Once the dog gets there, can you get the dog out easily or no? Because if it's really in it, it's hard to get out, right?
uh, usually the dog is like acting more of it said look if the dog looks like it's in the shitter,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's why you need balance, right? You don't want your dog to be in the shitter. um
In
but
general,
and
right?
in general, but that's also, I mean, that goes to another saying where time takes time,
Yeah. I like that one a lot, actually.
right? Which you can't, there's certain things you can't rush, and if you try to rush them, that's when you get the imbalance in your training, and then that's what the one mistake I used to make was that I would try to use pressure to get the dog to do something that he didn't really want to do. And it was before the dog had full understanding, you know. And that's where if you catch yourself where the dog's not doing what you expect, right? And you're not sure if the dog understands, you cannot use pressure to try to compel it
To do something it
um,
doesn't understand.
for something that the dog doesn't understand,
Right.
because you're just going to add more to that because the dog doesn't understand. He doesn't know what to do,
Right.
you know.
Which is, another phrase that's thrown out there and used in the school is that a correction in a language that the dog does not understand will always be perceived as aversive.
Yes. Yep. And that's where the language comes in when we talk about languages, um, which is a saying, right? That the the language of positive reinforcement is a separate language from negative reinforcement,
Right.
right? And if you teach in one
Mm.
language, say positive reinforcement, you have to correct in that same language. You can't jump to another language to correct in.
Right. Which is the premise of popo ne versus NePoPo, right? Because popo ne is that the dog has never been shown how to overcome pressure or the meaning of pressure in its life, right? It's only been taught you do something, you get something, you do something, you get something, but it's never been shown how to overcome pressure when it's presented.
Yeah. And that's where when we talk about understanding, it's not just the dog understanding that if I sit, I'm going to get rewarded.
Right.
It's understanding that there's a pressure component to it, right? Is teaching the understanding of the pressure into the behavior. And then you can use that later to teach that if you don't do the behavior, the pressure will come.
Right.
Or if we talk about duration, if you break the behavior, pressure will come until you go back into that behavior.
Which,
And
yes. And this kind of paves the way for another interesting observation I've had. And people in dog training know this, but when you give a dog a cue or instruction to do something and the dog does not do, you must reinforce that command negatively so that the dog does it. Otherwise, the dog has learned that your commands, your cues have no meaning because it's really just do it when you feel like it. That's what you're doing. If you don't make the dog do, you're essentially giving the dog the the statement that, okay, well, just do it when you want to do it, right? And we all know how many times dogs end up wanting to do what we want them to do in that situation. And so never give your dog that cue to do something unless you're willing to either pay it or compel it to do the thing it was told to do.
they're both reinforcement, right?
Right.
Which is what you said, is if you reinforce it with food or reward, or you reinforce it with pressure.
Right.
But that's where,
Or
you know,
reinforce it with the removal of pressure.
correct,
Yeah.
correct. And that's where, like, we say correction in NePoPo,
Yeah.
but it doesn't mean the way most people use it. And that's why the definition for that is important, because you can, most people say if your dog doesn't sit, the normal thing to say is give your dog a correction, right? When it knows how to sit. But then at the same time, that person, if the dog is digging, they will tell the person, correct your dog, give your dog a correction for digging. You can't
And do
have
you,
two meanings for
and
the
do you know what
same
most
word.
people do? And do you know what most people do when if you're a dog trainer and you say correct your dog, what's their go-to correction?
Verbal.
They say no. They say
They say
no,
no.
right?
Yeah,
The no is not a correction, right?
correct. No is a marker that is pinpointing a behavior that will have a consequence attached to it.
Yes, and so for unless you've been skilled in developing that bridge where no is associated with the promise of consequence, then no has no value to your dog. But it's a human, it's an anthropomorphism, it's an anthropomorphism actually, that we project the understanding of no. No to us means, oh, we did something wrong and we shouldn't have done that. And we project that understanding onto the dog who doesn't have that same understanding, right?
Yeah.
Therefore, it does not act as a consequence or a punishment or correction of sorts.
No, for most people, this is what no does. For most, like, especially like just pet people. No announces that if you keep going, I may come over there and stop you. And that's why dogs, people say no, no, no. The dog keeps going, doing whatever it's doing. And then when you physically start walking over to the dog, then they stop.
Right. That's the because the promise is now it's guaranteed because you're moving towards them.
Yeah. But you haven't created that association with the word no,
Yes.
where the dog stops when you say no. They know they have
And
time. They can wait. You're not going to do anything until you start walking over there.
so what they're trying to do by saying no, they're only using 50% of the classical punishment, right? They're using the marker of the future possibility of punishment, but they don't follow it up with the consequence that actually gives the no word the meaning,
Yeah.
right?
And usually the consequence for the no is not enough to stop it in the future. Right.
So So this is why, and we I think we kind of talked about this in our early episodes. This is why, and I don't have anything with emotion, right? There's nothing wrong with being excited with your dog because heck, half the time you're training your dog, it's fun and exciting, and you're gonna be happy, right? But it's not the emotion that the dog is looking for in the end. Like it's part of it, right? Yes, it's a contribution that the dog does enjoy, but it's if all they worked for was for your emotion and it stopped there, there was no reward event, reinforcing opportunity for play, ball, chasing a frisbee, getting a treat, right? Or freedom, right? You know, like you set your dog free and let them go crazy for a nice little walk or something. That's
Yeah.
really the reinforcer and not the reward. And we've talked about that. We don't need to dive into that now, but it's also important to understand that reward is not always reinforcement. Reinforcement is what strengthens behavior and when behavior is strengthened. Um,
Yeah. What the emotion is, it becomes an intermittent, um, like it's the same as like intermittent reinforcement. The emotion without any reward attached to it, right, is just an intermittent level of reinforcement. It just announces to the dog you may get a reward.
but
That's why
yes,
the emotion becomes powerful. It's not that the emotion itself is the reward. The
no,
emotion
oh, sorry.
announces that there's possibility for reward.
And the higher the human emotion, the dog is perceiving that with stronger emotion, the promise of the thing he really wants is more secured, right? Because if I'm really, yeah, good boy, of course, there's a high likelihood that he gets his ball or some food or a treat or whatever it is, right? Versus if I'm like, nice, buddy, like there's less possibility in the dog's understanding that the reward might come because I'm not as emotive, which is why the value of training without that emotion before the reward event happens is so valuable because it kind of cheats the dog or the dog it allows the dog to cheat the system because he can say, okay, depending on the volume, the emotion in the marker, and yes, that's going to determine how likely I am to get something of greater value or better value, right? So if you want, and if you want the dog to get addicted, you need to keep all of those things unpredictable. It's like, again, going back to the gambling, right? If you knew which slot machine was hot, everyone would go there, right? If that slot machine had like an emoji floating over its head with a big grin on its face saying, "I'm hot. You pull this lever, you're going to get a big payout." Everyone would just choose to go to that one. But there, it's I think that's where some of the difficulty comes into play is like, market and the value of a clicker. You market, and then after the dog is marked with a neutral marker, then you can be like, "Whoa, good boy." And that includes it in part of the reinforcement event, right?
That kind of like what you said, where the emotion comes after you mark, right? After the reward kind of thing, and it's a compliment to it. There is a saying that where the emotion comes before, right? And it's chicky chicky chaka, where you're using the emotion to try to get the dog to be motivated, right? Or you're using movement, or you're using sound, or you're using all kinds of things to try to motivate the dog, to make the dog motivated. Where that's why we say chicky chicky chaka is not good, because the dog should be motivated on its own, right?
Intrinsic
For the
motivation.
behavior. Yeah, the behavior should cause the dog to be motivated for it, right? Rather than you having to like wake up the dog and motivate the dog for it to do that thing.
Yeah.
So no chicky chicky chaka.
What are some examples of chicky chicky chaka in dog training?
The easiest one is like in bite work, right? Where the dog is just there and then you have to come out and agitate it for it to turn on, which is another saying that we have where it's an active handler, reactive dog,
Yeah.
right? Which
So
is
you
the
train a dog.
opposite of what you want.
Yeah, I mean, some people would argue that there were people that will argue this, and the way you need to look at it is if the decoy or the helper is active in the beginning before the dog activates and does the barking or the forward aggression, you're training a dog. Yes, the dog might be able to display protective behaviors, right? But it will only do so after there's a threat presented,
Yeah.
right?
The difference is this: the dog is only becoming aggressive to try to defend itself
Yes, and it's
in that situation, rather than the dog becoming aggressive to try to fight you because it wants to fight you.
or another thing another way to look at that is the dog being aggressive when it doesn't feel when it doesn't perceive a threat. Maybe the owner perceives a threat, but the dog doesn't see it as a threat. That's where the problem comes in, is that you need the dog to protect or to aggress on verbal command, not when the dog feels threatened, right? Because the human attached to that leash might feel threatened by someone in a dark hoodie walking towards them at night, right? Maybe the dog doesn't see why they need to be barking at that person because they're, somewhere where they've never been trained to bark. But that's why the active dog needs to be actively an active dog, is so that you can cue the dog regardless of how the dog feels.
Yeah. Right. And that's the difference, right? If the person, the handler, or whatever, the person becomes aggressive, and then the dog goes, "Oh, now I have to fight you," rather than the dog going, "Hey, come over here because I want to fight you," and then the person becoming aggressive
Yeah,
after the dog. So that's the thing. The dog, active dog, reactive handler, or reactive decoy, or reactive helper,
right. Because
right? I think,
because when the helper or the decoy is reactive to the dog, so the dog starts barking, the helper starts agitating after the dog has initiated. Now it's perceived as it's a rewarding event. It is now the dog is like, "Hey, fight me, fight me." Like, "Okay, let's go." And now that reinforces the dog's behavior because that's what he wanted, right? And so now
yeah,
you're teaching the dog. Now this isn't a NePoPo term, but like now you're bordering into the territory of what people call in the industry as They label it as fight drive. A dog who wants to engage and fight, right? They want the fight. That's that's how you get that. But you won't ever get to fight drive until you have a dog that's active intrinsically, and
Yeah.
a dog that does not wait for someone else a whipping boy to go around like whipping and cracking his clatter stick or a whip before the dog will start
The,
aggressing.
yeah. And the difference is this: the dog that wants to fight, or as opposed to the dog that thinks it has to fight,
Right.
right?
And those are two different qualitative outcomes, right? In the behaviors. The dog that wants to fight is a lot more enthusiastic, like committed, right? Versus the dog that feels like he has to fight. He's going to try to get out as soon as possible, right? He might throw a jab and then duck and run.
Yep. Yes. Which means the that'll lead into the bite too, right? It's
Yes, the
the
quality of
dog's
the
not going to
bite.
want to the dog's not going to want to stay in the bite,
And
as
he's only
opposed
going
to
to
the other
bite
one is the other one
minimally.
wants to fight you. He wants you to come closer so he can, fight you.
Right. One's trying to eat you, one's trying to just like nibble at you.
Yep.
Good. So
Um,
Chicky Chaka, pretty well covered. One other example, Mike, what would you give a Chicky Chaka example for people in pet training so that people can see and identify that in their own training? Because it happens in pet obedience training too.
it's kind of like when the person has to really become energized in order to get the dog to become energized, right? They're using a lot of baby talk and everything to try to get the dog motivated,
So
you know. Um,
classic example is you have a flat dog, but you want the dog to be a little bit more peppy, a little bit more spry. And so, in order to do that, you know that your dog maybe likes the sweet talk, the baby talk. Oh, you want to go play? You want to do this? And then you start like maybe throw the frisbee for the dog a couple times. Well, here's the problem with that is if the dog was flat and then you started throwing the frisbee for it, why would it ever want to work and put in effort to get the frisbee when he knows he can get the frisbee for free without putting in the effort? That's the problem Chicky Chaka presents to people in pet obedience or just any obedience is that you put the cart before the horse, where the reward comes before the work. And
yeah.
now the dog knows that the reward is easy. So why put in any effort? Because I can just rely on rely on doggy welfare to give it what it wants, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's good. There's a phrase where Bart says, "It will happen in three times." He goes, "It won't happen." Then he goes, "Yes, it will happen. It will happen in three times. Not today, not tomorrow, never." Which kind of goes like what you're saying. Like the dog, trying to get the dog motivated,
Right.
you know.
So will Chicky Chaka ever give you a prancy, happy dog doing obedience in three times?
It will happen in three times. Not today, not tomorrow, never. Which is basically saying that it's not going to happen, right?
Yeah,
In a colorful way.
right. They give
But also it's kind of like what you're talking about, like when Bart says happy horse shit. And that when it's like kind of when the dog is just kind of messing around, right? Or when you're just doing things that don't give
just
any outcome.
it's goofing around, goofing off,
Yep.
which is the opposite of like, the other phrase that's out there. You'll hear it in the schools is church music, right? The church music for the dog is like exercises, training methods, activities that require focus.
Yeah. So the church music is the stuff that the obedience, the stuff you have to do,
Yes,
right? But that you're kind of doing because you have to in order to get what you want,
right. And what is the stuff that you want? You want the
versus the rock and roll,
yeah.
right? Which is the stuff that you like to do because it's exciting. But
Everyone likes to
again, the
party.
balance comes in. You have to have both. You have to teach the church music, and then sometimes you go into the rock and roll, right?
Right,
Eventually.
right.
So, but you shouldn't go into the rock and roll until you've learned the church music.
Which, if you're looking at the the metaphor of church music versus rock and roll, it's a descriptor of the Premack principle, right? You go through lesser value activities to get a higher value activity as a reward.
Yes. Yeah.
More to
But
come on that
it's
subject later.
yeah. That's where you have to have like both, and you have to have the stuff that dog has to do, and then the stuff that dog likes to do. And with NePoPo, we're trying to get everything to be the stuff the dog likes to do,
Right.
right? Is that's where the heart and soul comes in. Is where the church music becomes
Rock and roll.
rock and roll eventually, you know. Uh, and then if you get that right, and you do it right, and you get to the end, you get to another phrase that Bart uses, which is now you're in Valhalla. Now you're in like paradise. You're on level 3 of the learning pyramid, and everything is flowing. Everything is good.
Question is, does it require death to get to Valhalla? Does the dog have to die before you get to Valhalla? Or maybe the handler dies before the dog gets to Valhalla.
Yeah, if you if from if you're using only positive reinforcement, you're going to need so many reps, and to get to the point where it's on cue, always on cue, that maybe you'll never reach Valhalla.
Right.
You just keep trying with new dogs. I only have a few more. Oh, there's one that goes back to like the sugar and the stick. And we're talking about pressure. And when you add pressure, what Bart would say, scratching the dog's ass. You have to scratch the dog's ass a little,
Right.
right? And that's where you're going to add pressure for motivation,
Mm-hmm.
and some dogs need that a little bit,
So it's that the whip, the
certain
kickstart.
instances.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's or the spurs in the flank of the horse to, you kick it with the spurs to get it going.
I think that's about it.
Bird thrown around. Yeah.
Well,
Pretty good list.
actually, where it's this goes to the positive reinforcement training world, and how they talk about everything positive reinforcement, but behind the scenes, they are not only using positive reinforcement,
Oh yeah. Yep.
right? And the term, and being not telling the truth of what you do and making it seem like you're
I did saying one thing and doing the other,
yeah. So it's what
preaching.
they say, preaching water but drinking wine,
Yeah.
right? Whereas you're saying like this is the only way to do something, but in reality, when in hiding, you're doing something else.
And usually when I've heard that phrase, it's alluding to people who claim to be positive only trainers, but behind the scenes they're using the e-collar or they're using tools. That's usually where I hear that phrase thrown around, is that people who, you know, promote themselves as a positive only trainer, the optics of their dog, the reliability has come from only positive training. Most of the time it's to appease certain political dogmas and ideologies within the
Yeah.
dog training world.
We preach wine and drink whiskey.
Suicide.
uh, oh, there was one. Yeah, that was another thing that I remember. It was when you're trying to make a dog strong, right? You're trying to build him up, and that's where like Bart would say sometimes you have to let him drink whiskey and smoke cigarettes,
Let them loose, right?
right?
Because it builds them up. It lets them feel like there's, again, kind of building the dog, making a dog stronger, letting them do things they're not supposed to can give them a sense of like high confidence, right?
Yeah, well, you get a little hooligan,
Yeah.
right? Where they want to push their boundaries a little bit. You want to let them enjoy,
Right.
And that goes to motivation, right? If you have to have the motivation to be able to, that's another saying, so you can squeeze them, right?
Right.
You can't squeeze them without the motivation. So you
Yeah,
have
if
to
there's
have
no
that
juice in the
motivation.
lemon, you can't squeeze it, right? You get
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah. Some dogs already have the motivation, right? They have a lot of motivation. But other dogs, that's where that comes in. You have to let them drink whiskey and smoke cigarettes a little bit
Right.
so that they can have that motivation, that confidence
Right.
before you can squeeze them a little bit. I think we went through everything that we were thinking about.
Yeah, that's good. So to recap, if you're new to NePoPo, new to the community, there's a lot of language that takes a minute to familiarize yourself with. Hopefully, this has been helpful in giving you kind of a glossary of terms and phrases that are thrown around so you're not like completely lost and find that helpful. I think we had some really good conversations about some training aspects here as well. So
Yeah,
I think it's been a good conversation, and I agree. I think that's basically covers a lot of it. So the listeners
I
should be
think that's
set.
good. And remember, it's NePoPo, not Popone.
Nay popo, not popone. That's the other thing is like you need to constantly ask yourself. Bart and Michael are always saying, when you go to when they were previously teaching golds, they would ask every student, "Are you in the system that you think you're in?"
Yeah.
Meaning, are you actually like, is your dog, are you able to use negative reinforcement when your dog is showing you like maybe it's getting shut down? Because if you're using negative reinforcement and the dog is shutting down, you probably aren't in the system that you think you are. You probably it shows us that you are probably trained and have a foundation in the positive reinforcement methods, but you're using a method that the dog doesn't understand and doesn't he's not clear on, so he doesn't feel comfortable with.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what it comes down to is the understanding from the dog,
Right.
right? Which is just because you are thinking the dog or you're trying to imply something to the dog, it doesn't mean the dog understands it,
Which,
right? And that's where, like, when you say, "Are you in the system that you think you are?" Is just that. It's are you in ne popo or in popo ne?
right,
Right? Did you forget to add the pressure to the learning phase? You
right.
know, are you trying to use pressure before the dog understands? Yeah, you have to look at it. Just comes down to looking at your dog.
And that's exactly, and I was going to say that's why it's important before you begin training to understand how to read what your dog is experiencing, the behaviors, the body language, the mannerisms that will inform your decisions and will confirm or deny factual evidence that you're doing something right or wrong, right? So without the ability to read that behavior in the dog, you may be walking down a path that you are with your dog that is actually not effective or the right path to be on for your dog.
And then you have to know where your dog is the key. Where's your dog in the training progression? And one of the things I remember more than anything is where it says, "What do you do if your dog doesn't do, but does not know how to do?" Right? The answer to that is you do nothing
Right,
because he doesn't understand. You have to go back and teach more. And then also, what do you do if your dog doesn't do, but knows very well how to do? Now you can, you know, scratch his ass a little bit.
yeah. Man, episode 17 coming in clutch at the end. The final 10 seconds here. Bringing some highly charged valuable advice. Yeah.
As always, if you like the episode, please share it if you can. If you like it, share it.
Yep.
If you don't like it, tell us why. Leave us a comment.
Yep.
Um, if you have any questions, again, you can leave comments or send us a message, and we'd be happy to go into more depth on those.
when we set out to do this podcast, we wanted to help those who have been attending the schools, that were considering attending the schools, and then even just open up the conversation into modern dog training concepts and spend time discussing, explaining concepts that weren't getting adequate time, or that don't get adequate time and discussion because they're swept aside because it's either not, you know, the thing people want to be spending their time understanding, or whatever it is. But hopefully this helps out. Yeah. So
Yeah.
hopefully we're meeting that goal for the viewers and listeners.
Yeah. And it's also because, like, a lot of times what we take for granted, what we have learned, we think that other people know or understand the same things,
Right.
but they haven't necessarily experienced it or been, exposed to it. So it's a lot of times it's good to go over things that, we take for granted, that we think that everybody knows, and
And
just, go over it again, so they maybe there's something that they didn't catch the first time,
and
right?
it's
From
just
where
like the
they were.
saying, back to the time takes time. Like even though you may by definition know how to regurgitate the definition of a certain concept or a term, it's the time playing around with that concept correctly, the internalization that comes over time using it the correct way. That's the value. And that's why time takes time, is like, you know, you might understand what luring is, but do you master luring just because you understand the definition of luring? No, you don't.
It's yeah, exactly. It's doing the work, right? For the things that you've learned, is putting it into practice.
The
Um,
last thing, the last thing that the one thing we didn't cover, the phrase is the one yes, but, because there's always one situation where this may work, but it might not
yeah,
work in another situation. So there's always yes, but.
yes. And a lot of times the only way to learn that the but part is by trying the things out,
It's experimenting. Don't,
right? Experimenting. And
yes,
that's where you can't know the concept or anything until you have tried it out. Just because you believe something works or doesn't work, it doesn't necessarily make it true until you've put it into practice,
that's
right?
so
And
much
seeing
truth.
how the dog reacts,
So
you
much
know.
truth right there. So much truth right there. So,
Cool.
anyways, before we keep droning on and start having listeners drop off, we'll end here. Thanks for listening. This was episode 17 of the Full Quadrant podcast.
Thank you very much. We will see you later.